Sarah Ferguson is closer than ever to losing Royal Lodge, that is the headline gripping Britain tonight. And insiders say the clock was already ticking when an unexpected countermove sent shockwaves through Windsor. This is not speculation, not a gentle reshuffle, but what senior palace staff privately describe as the most serious threat to her position in years. What happened behind closed doors? And how did the woman once labeled the Forgotten Duchess suddenly become the obstacle no one in the upper court saw coming? Stay with us, because what unfolds in the next few minutes shapes everything that follows. For weeks, quiet murmurs around the estate grew into unmistakable warnings. Royal Lodge, the sprawling residence tied to the York household since the 1980s, had become the center of a strategic recalibration. The repairs, the negotiations, the pressure, everything pointed to one outcome. Sarah Ferguson would soon be forced to pack her bags. It wasn't announced, it wasn't written, but insiders kept hearing the same phrase repeated in briefings: streamline the properties, streamline the presence. And in that coded language, streamlining meant removal. The tension was undeniable. Senior aides whispered that the Queen Consort's circle viewed the York residence as an unnecessary relic, something that no longer aligned with the modern image being curated. One staff member, speaking off record, claimed the push had been building for months, a quiet campaign to shrink Andrew's footprint and erase the last symbolic pockets of old influence. Each memo, each unofficial note, pointed toward the same conclusion. This time, Sarah wouldn't be spared by nostalgia or sympathy. Yet just as the machinery seemed set in motion, the narrative jolted sideways. Without warning, Sarah appeared at a major public event, supporting one of Catherine's signature charity initiatives, a soft-spoken appearance, humble on the surface, but explosive in its timing. Cameras caught it, commentators amplified it, and within hours, the public rallied behind her with a warmth the palace had not anticipated. Headlines described her as renewed, grounded, a patron with purpose. That shift in tone alone was enough to trigger emergency conversations among senior courtiers. Her return wasn't loud, but insiders say it was calculated. She didn't lecture, she didn't defend herself. She simply stood beside Catherine, and that image, two women, united by dignity rather than power, swept across social platforms faster than any official statement could. Palace watchers were blunt. You can't evict someone the public has just embraced. Another insider put it more sharply. It became a public relations nightmare overnight. And that is where the atmosphere inside the household turned. Plans that once seemed firm suddenly grew uncertain. Some staff described the mood as hesitant, others as frustrated. Aides aligned with Clarence House pushed for consistency, insisting the process must continue. Royal Lodge must be addressed. But another faction, closer to Kensington, quietly advised caution. The optics were too fragile, the timing too volatile, and Catherine's subtle but unmistakable warmth toward Sarah became the unspoken firewall no one dared cross. The result was a temporary freeze, not publicly acknowledged, but unmistakable in the sudden silence from briefing channels. Reports that had circulated confidently only days earlier evaporated from conversation. Invitations were paused. Communications slowed. No one would confirm a decision, but insiders agreed. The situation had shifted. Now the real question hovers in the air. Was Sarah's appearance a coincidence, a natural return to public work, or a carefully timed maneuver designed to anchor her position before the palace could move against her? One royal historian suggested it bluntly. She may have just played the smartest card of her post-royal life. What happens next is unpredictable, the kind of uncertainty that makes even longtime palace observers pause. But what is clear tonight is this. Sarah Ferguson is no longer standing quietly on the sidelines. She has stepped back into the narrative at the precise moment her future home hung in the balance. And as the dust settles from this first tremor, the next moves will define far more than the fate of Royal Lodge. The storm has only begun. The move that altered the entire equation began quietly, almost too quietly, which is why the palace didn't see it coming. While senior aides were still circulating internal notes about transitioning occupants during the refurbishment period, Sarah Ferguson made a sudden, strategic re-entry, and this time, she didn't return alone. Her alignment with Princess Catherine, subtle yet unmistakable, triggered the kind of public reaction that turns administrative plans into political liabilities. And tonight, insiders insist this single countermove may have stalled what many believed was her inevitable removal from Royal Lodge. What looked, on the surface, like a soft charity appearance, became something else entirely once the footage hit morning broadcasts. Sarah, arriving with that familiar calm, carrying boxes for a children's initiative supported by Catherine's foundation, was the image editors replayed on loop. Viewers saw sincerity, commentators saw narrative power. One broadcast journalist noted, "It wasn't the Duchess of old. She looked purposeful, anchored, almost revitalized." And that is exactly what started the trouble behind palace walls. Senior staff at Kensington were quick to clarify that Catherine had not invited Sarah directly, but insiders emphasized something much more important. Catherine didn't distance herself either. In the royal system, silence can be a weapon, but it can also be a shield. And her quiet warmth, the way she acknowledged Sarah with a soft nod captured clearly on camera, was enough to send a coded message. Catherine understood the optics instantly, one insider said. She didn't orchestrate the scene, but she certainly didn't waste its impact. Once the clip went viral, public sentiment shifted almost overnight. Viewers flooded comment sections with praise for Sarah's resilience, calling her a comeback story the monarchy needs, and proof that grace can outlast scandal. The coverage became so overwhelmingly positive that communications teams found themselves scrambling, trying to work out how the narrative had slipped from administrative procedure into emotional territory. The palace hadn't prepared for this. Their internal language still framed Sarah's potential relocation as a logistical necessity, a plan to streamline, synchronize, restructure. But logistics become political when the public attaches feelings to them. A senior courtier put it sharply, "We were operating in a spreadsheet, and Sarah dragged us back into the real world." And that, according to several staff members, is when the plan began to wobble. It wasn't only the public shift that unsettled the system. It was the speed at which Catherine's supporters mobilized online. Without any official encouragement, they highlighted Sarah's long charitable history, resurfaced clips of her past interviews about family loyalty, and contrasted her warmth with the cold, bureaucratic tone of the eviction rumors. The comparison wasn't intentional, but it was devastating. By the next morning, several major outlets carried headlines questioning why the palace would punish someone who had just shown renewed dedication to service. Inside the palace, frustration simmered. Clarence House aides reportedly argued that public sympathy cannot dictate property management, but their stance suddenly looked outdated and unsteady. Meanwhile, Kensington Palace remained notably quiet, the kind of silence that insiders recognize as strategic. One royal correspondent said, "When one side talks and the other does not, the audience chooses its hero." And Sarah, almost effortlessly, became the hero. The turning point came when a mid-level staff report never meant to leak mentioned that accelerating the transition may provoke unnecessary public backlash given current sentiment. It was a single line, buried near the end of the document, but when it surfaced in the tabloids, the damage was immediate. Commentators seized on the phrase. Morning talk shows debated whether the palace was targeting Sarah unfairly, and the idea of backlash became the new word haunting every internal meeting. Catherine's team, according to insiders, quietly recommended pausing the process, not to interfere politically, but to avoid further chaos. They argued that a non-essential conflict during a sensitive moment is counterproductive, and because Catherine's public favor was at its highest point in years, her viewpoint carried weight even in rooms she wasn't standing in. The Queen Consort's circle, however, read the situation very differently. According to one longtime court staffer, the mood at Clarence House turned tight and irritable. They believed the York resurgence, especially one tied to Catherine, complicated a long-term plan to redistribute royal properties more strategically. One insider put it bluntly, this was not the week they wanted Sarah Ferguson trending for the right reasons. Yet by then, the tide was already moving. Once the public embraced Sarah's reappearance, the palace's hands grew tied. To push ahead aggressively would look punitive. To step back entirely would look weak. And so the process entered an uneasy limbo, a freeze that no one officially acknowledged, but everyone understood. Sarah, for her part, said nothing. She didn't gloat, hint, or play coy with the press. She simply carried on with her work. And that restraint, insiders say, is what made her countermove so effective. She played it quietly, a palace aide said. And quiet can be the most dangerous style of power. Something fundamental had shifted. The plan to remove her was no longer an administrative task. It was a political minefield. And as the palace recalculated, one thing became clear. Sarah Ferguson had changed the game, and not by force, but by timing, optics, and an alliance stronger than anyone expected. But the tremor was only the beginning. What followed next would shake the palace far deeper. Camilla's irritation was no longer a rumor. It was an atmosphere, thick enough that even junior staff felt it the moment they stepped into Clarence House. The narrative wasn't supposed to shift this way. The property restructuring had been moving quietly, methodically, and then suddenly, Sarah Ferguson's resurgence, amplified by Catherine's steady glow, disrupted months of calculated groundwork. and those closest to the Queen Consort say she recognized the threat instantly. According to one senior aide, Camilla's first reaction was controlled disbelief, but that control dissolved once the morning papers arrived. Every front page framed Sarah's appearance as a symbol of renewal, redemption, or quiet strength, and not a single column mentioned the ongoing push to relocate her from Royal Lodge. To the Queen Consort circle, the omission was worse than criticism. It was a sign that the narrative had left their hands entirely. One insider put it bluntly, she could feel the reins slipping. What fueled Camilla's frustration further was the undeniable role Catherine played, even without speaking. Catherine didn't engineer the moment, but her grace turned it into something magnetic. Commentators kept repeating the same line, "Catherine welcomes," the public responds. That kind of natural influence has always been the hardest for palace strategists to manage, because it doesn't rely on press briefings or rehearsed appearances, it just happens. And for Camilla, who built her authority through consistency, silence, and careful alliances, the unpredictability of it all was infuriating. Inside Clarence House, discussions grew tense. Several advisors urged the Queen Consort to stay the course, insisting that Sarah's sudden popularity would fade as quickly as it appeared. But others warned that continuing the pressure could backfire spectacularly. "The optics are unstable," one advisor said. "If we push now, it looks personal." And that was the very impression they needed to avoid. Still, Camilla's instincts leaned toward decisive action. For years, she had meticulously shaped her internal network, a circle of trusted aides, longtime courtiers, and loyal press allies. Their influence was built on continuity and discipline, and they viewed the York resurgence as a destabilizing intrusion. But it wasn't just the resurgence, it was the alignment. Sarah and Catherine side by side was not merely a pleasant image, it was a shift in gravitational pull. Two women with public affection behind them can unsettle an entire structure, one palace historian remarked. It recalls the old shadows, the Diana effect. And that, insiders say, is precisely what stung. Camilla had spent decades unraveling those comparisons, rebuilding her narrative one cautious year at a time. Now, without warning, a different pair of women had recreated that dynamic. One foot in the past, one foot in the future, and neither of them required palace approval to do it. Behind closed doors, Camilla's irritation sharpened into determination. Meetings that were once routine turned brisk. Suggestions became orders. Communication strategies were pulled back for revision. She wanted clarity, a staff member said. She wanted to know who allowed the situation to escalate. In the palace ecosystem, frustration flows downward, and suddenly, aides began to feel the pressure of proving control. At the same time, Camilla's media allies tried to recalibrate the narrative. Subtle pieces appeared, hinting that the Royal Lodge repairs were urgent, or that the York household was delaying essential transitions. Yet none of these attempts gained footing. The public wasn't interested in logistics anymore. They were invested in Sarah's comeback and Catherine's quiet solidarity. And no amount of strategic commentary could compete with the power of a single, well-timed image. Kensington Palace didn't counter or escalate, and that silence became its own kind of statement. It was diplomacy by non-engagement, said one royal correspondent. When Catherine chooses not to intervene, she leaves the public to draw its own conclusions. Those conclusions were overwhelmingly sympathetic to Sarah and cautiously supportive of Catherine's seemingly effortless humanity. Meanwhile, Clarence House saw that sympathy as a threat. Senior figures worried that if Sarah gained too much positive attention, it would become politically impossible to proceed with the relocation. More troubling was the fear that Catherine's rising influence, even accidental, could overshadow Camilla's carefully built internal authority. One insider summarized it simply: the power balance was shifting, and the Queen Consort felt it. Oh! The internal tension reached a point where even seasoned courtiers began whispering about parallel households, a phrase that had not been uttered aloud since the turbulent years following Diana's divorce. While not a war, not a confrontation, the dynamic carried the unmistakable scent of competition, a quiet struggle for moral ground, optics, and emotional loyalty. And this was where Camilla's frustration hardened into resolve. Those in her circle said she became laser-focused on regaining control, initiating private discussions on how to stabilize the narrative. Yet every countermeasure seemed to falter, because the issue was no longer structural, it was emotional. Sarah had tapped into something the Queen Consort's team couldn't replicate: authenticity. By the end of the week, the mood at Clarence House was unmistakably sour. Aides walked carefully, communications slowed, and the Queen Consort withdrew into tightly controlled engagements. But even in the silence, one fact was clear. For the first time in years, Camilla felt genuinely challenged, and the challenge was only growing. Because Sarah's quiet comeback was not just a moment, it was the beginning of a shift that would soon collide head-on with the Queen Consort's inner circle, triggering a series of revelations no one inside the palace was prepared to manage. The shift from irritation to alarm began the moment a single document appeared in the wrong hands, or perhaps, as some insiders insist, the right ones. It wasn't a dossier, not a scandal pack, not an explosive leak in the traditional sense. It was a quiet, typed briefing, circulated internally, never intended for public consumption, and yet its existence alone was enough to tilt the palace atmosphere from tense to volatile. For days, no one could explain where it came from, who drafted it, or how it escaped its intended route. But one certainty gripped both Clarence House and Buckingham. This document had changed the temperature of the entire Royal Lodge dispute. It began with a line so understated, yet so damning, that even the most seasoned staff recognized its impact immediately. The decision to expedite the transition at Royal Lodge risks triggering avoidable public disruption. It wasn't an accusation, it wasn't a warning. It was an assessment, clinical, internal, and devastating. And the moment that line reached the outside world, everything shifted. When the press got hold of it, headlines exploded. Commentators framed the statement as evidence that the palace anticipated backlash, meaning there was something to hide. Morning talk shows spent entire segments speculating whether the document indicated internal disagreement. Royal analysts dissected every word. Some argued the tone resembled the language of Kensington's advisors. Others claimed it read closer to the phrasing used by mid-tier strategists at Buckingham. But the theory that dominated the conversation was far more provocative, that the briefing had been circulated by someone sympathetic to Sarah Ferguson. Inside the palace, that theory hit like a shockwave. Clarence House aides were furious, insisting the leak was engineered to sabotage restructuring plans. One senior figure, speaking with visible frustration, allegedly said, "This is no longer property management, it is a narrative war." And they were right. The public narrative, once neutral, had now shifted entirely in Sarah's favor. Comment threads filled with support. Editorials questioned the fairness of the relocation. A popular host declared, "You don't push out a woman who's finally finding her voice again." The tide was unmistakable and unstoppable. What unsettled Camilla's circle most was not the content of the document, but the reaction it generated. People were not just sympathetic, they were protective. The idea that Sarah might be forced out after decades of loyalty clashed sharply with the image of a monarchy striving for compassion and modernity. Catherine's quiet presence only amplified the tension. She had said nothing, done nothing overt, yet her alignment with Sarah hovered over every discussion like an unspoken verdict. Meanwhile, Kensington Palace maintained its familiar strategy: dignified distance. No comment, no rebuttal, no spin. And that silence became its own form of endorsement. "They understand the power of not interfering," one correspondent explained. "When you say nothing, the public fills the silence with trust." The public saw Catherine as the moral compass and, by extension, viewed Sarah's position as deserving of protection. In stark contrast, Clarence House scrambled for footing. Multiple redrafts of internal memos were ordered. Communications teams were instructed to emphasize structural necessity, but those efforts fell flat. People didn't want to hear about roofs, renovations, or timetables. They wanted a human story, and Sarah had provided one effortlessly. The true panic set in when whispers emerged that the leaked briefing might be only one piece of a broader set of internal documents. Some aides feared that additional memos could surface, potentially exposing deeper disagreements about Royal Lodge, or worse, revealing behind-the-scenes pressure exerted by certain senior figures. One insider described the mood as controlled dread, with staff quietly auditing their digital correspondence, looking for vulnerabilities. And then came the question that no one dared raise aloud, at least not in official meetings. Who exactly stood to benefit from the leak? While no evidence pointed to Sarah directly, the timing was suspiciously favorable. Even more intriguing was the theory circulating among mid-level staff that someone within Buckingham, uncomfortable with Clarence House's assertiveness, used the Royal Lodge conflict as a way to push back indirectly. The speculation became so heated that King Charles reportedly requested a review of internal communication protocols, not an investigation, but a clarity check, a phrase that insiders say is used only when trust is beginning to fracture. And fracture it did. Suddenly, staff who normally worked fluidly across departments began guarding their discussions, tightening access to schedules, and requesting confirmation for decisions that once moved seamlessly. Aides who had previously spoken confidently about Sarah's relocation now hesitated. One remarked, "Every move feels like a trap. If we push, it looks punitive. If we pause, It looks like we've lost control. The Queen Consort's team knew the optics were shifting, and fast. But perhaps the most consequential reaction came from Catherine's side. According to sources, her advisors quietly recognized the magnitude of the moment. The leaked briefing did more than protect Sarah. It destabilized the narrative that had kept Camilla's influence steady for years. And while Kensington did not orchestrate the chaos, they understood its implications. Catherine's position as the monarchy's emotional anchor grew stronger with every misstep from Clarence House. By the end of the week, one truth was undeniable. The Royal Lodge ordeal was no longer a logistical matter, it was a catalyst. The document had upended months of planning, strained alliances, and exposed fractures normally hidden from public view. And in the center of the storm stood Sarah Ferguson, calm, quiet, and increasingly undeniable. But the shock was not over. What happened next would move the entire dispute from political inconvenience to full-scale internal recalibration, setting the stage for negotiations that no one expected and few were prepared to handle. Negotiations began not with a meeting, but with a silence. The kind of silence insiders recognize as the prelude to a shift in strategy. The Royal Lodge situation had grown too large, too emotional, too combustible to leave unmanaged. And so, without any formal announcement, senior aides from 3 different households began what one insider called a delicate triangulation, an effort to stop the narrative from spiraling further and dragging the monarchy into a new public divide. The first move came from Buckingham. Faced with mounting public sympathy for Sarah and rising tension between the two courts, senior advisors proposed a reset. Pause the relocation, reassess the logistics, and quietly explore alternative solutions that wouldn't ignite further backlash. But even that suggestion carried political weight. Clarence House viewed the pause as a retreat. Kensington viewed it as necessary damage control, and Sarah, intentionally or not, became the fulcrum around which all sides shifted. Kensington's influence entered more subtly. Catherine did not intervene directly, but according to 2 well-placed insiders, her senior staff made a careful argument during weekly coordination briefings. A non-essential conflict with an adored public figure risks undermining trust at a sensitive moment. It wasn't a demand, not even a request. It was a framing, and in palace politics, framing shapes outcomes. The room reportedly fell noticeably quiet. When Catherine's team speaks that clearly, people listen, a staffer said. They know she rarely steps into internal matters unless the implications are significant. And they were significant. The monarchy had spent years cultivating an image of unity, modern humility, and emotional stability. Forcing Sarah out during a moment of rediscovered goodwill would look punitive, controlling, and out of touch, 3 optics the crown cannot afford. This was the argument that carried weight behind closed doors, not because it was political, but because it was undeniably correct. Sarah's position strengthened further when advisors realized she wasn't escalating the drama. She wasn't giving interviews, dropping hints, or feeding the press. Instead, she continued appearing at charitable engagements, demonstrating warmth without defiance. A senior figure from Buckingham described her demeanor as disarmingly gracious, adding, "She is making it impossible to justify any action against her without looking cruel." So the talks deepened. Clarence House pushed for a compromise that would preserve the long-term strategy, allow Sarah to remain temporarily, but maintain the expectation of relocation once renovations accelerated. Kensington countered, politely but firmly, that any timeline tied to public tension would only repeat the same crisis. Buckingham proposed a middle path: redefine Royal Lodge, not as a private residence, but as a semi-public service base, allowing Sarah's continued presence while aligning the property with broader institutional goals. Surprisingly, it was Sarah herself who tipped the balance without saying a word. A draft proposal, reportedly originating from her charitable office, suggested that Royal Lodge could host seasonal youth programs, literacy workshops, and rehabilitation initiatives for families in crisis. It was smart, an insider said. She reframed the house as an asset instead of a liability. More importantly, it made the notion of forcing her out appear counterproductive. Behind the scenes, Camilla's circle was deeply unsettled. What had begun as a straightforward estate adjustment had morphed into a political stalemate, and worse, a symbolic one. Every concession strengthens her narrative, a Clarence House aide complained. And Catherine stands to benefit, whether she intends to or not. The breakthrough came late in the week. According to those familiar with the talks, King Charles agreed to a soft compromise. Sarah would stay for the foreseeable future. Renovations would progress without displacing her. Future decisions would be revisited quietly, without pressure or deadlines. It wasn't a victory declared in public, but it was a victory nonetheless. And just like that, the dynamic shifted again. Royal Lodge was no longer a battleground. It was a negotiation table, one that Sarah had, against all expectations, managed to hold. But stabilizing the dispute didn't end the tension. It simply moved it. Because the moment she secured breathing room, another wave began forming. The public reappearance that would redefine her role and show the queen consort that the game had changed for good. The public didn't know the negotiations had shifted, but they felt the tremor the moment Sarah Ferguson stepped out again, not cautiously, not tentatively, but with a steadiness that made commentators pause mid-sentence. The Royal Lodge dispute had placed her at the edge of the narrative, but her next appearance pushed her firmly into its center. And this time, she wasn't merely protected by circumstance. She was empowered by momentum. It happened at a children's hospice event, the kind of engagement designed to be soft, hopeful, uncontroversial. Yet the symbolism was impossible to ignore. Catherine arrived with her signature calm. Sarah joined her minutes later, smiling with the quiet composure of someone who understood exactly what her presence meant. The moment cameras captured the two women walking side by side, the story rewrote itself. Again, commentators on morning television couldn't hide their fascination. "This isn't coincidence," one analyst said. "It looks like alignment." Another pointed out the detail that had already gone viral. Catherine gently guiding Sarah through the crowd, a gesture that read as both respect and endorsement. Subtle, simple, devastatingly effective. Behind palace walls, the reaction was sharper. Clarence House aides privately called the appearance a nightmare scenario, describing how it undercut months of property planning and strengthened the perception that Sarah now held a moral position impossible to challenge. The Queen Consort's circle, already unsettled by the leaked briefing and the public's surge of sympathy, reportedly viewed this latest development as the moment the narrative slipped beyond retrieval. But for Buckingham and Kensington, the event served a different purpose. It stabilized the atmosphere. It demonstrated unity without needing to declare it. And it reassured the public that the monarchy still understood the value of compassion over cold procedure. Two women showing humanity did more for the institution than any memo, a palace staffer observed. The most striking shift came from Sarah herself. She did not act triumphant or vindicated. She did not hint at the turmoil of the past weeks. She simply worked meeting families, speaking softly with volunteers, placing her hand over Catherine's in a moment captured by nearly every camera on site. The photo spread globally within hours, described by one outlet as a picture of restored dignity. It was that image, more than negotiations or leaks or strategy, that closed the chapter. Royal Lodge suddenly felt less like a contested asset and more like the backdrop to a woman regaining her footing after years of quiet endurance. And even insiders who once doubted her acknowledged the same truth. Sarah Ferguson was no longer an afterthought. She had become, through timing, resilience, and unexpected alliances, a symbol the monarchy couldn't afford to push aside. By the end of the week, the narrative had crystallized. Camilla's influence appeared muted. Catherine's moral authority grew stronger. And Sarah, steady, smiling, and surprisingly unshakable, held her ground without a single public confrontation. The story is far from finished. Royal Lodge remains a question mark. Palace alliances continue shifting, and the Queen Consort circle is already recalibrating. But for now, Sarah's position is secure, her voice restored, and her future, for the first time in many years, undeniably hers to shape. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for the next chapter, because in this royal saga, the next twist is never far away.